Hello, everyone. This is Sam, and I'm doing a look at what BGS IBMOR had posted about poverty is down, so why is violent crime up? Originally, I believe BGS posted this article from Obsidian as a discussion from a hangout. And what I've come to find is that this is a very interesting article. It's important in how we view what's happening in the world today with the African American. It's important what happens with income, and it's important what we see what happens with violent crime and poverty. And correlation versus causation. That's the theme of what I'm kind of talking about. Whenever I read this article, I'm one of those kind of people that go back and I look at the data. I want to look at and see what are the articles saying, what is the information that's presented, and so I can have a better understanding of what's occurring out here in society in general. All right, here's one of the graphs that PGS put forth. He kind of talked about how, it's important for us to do research, right? It's important for us to go through the data and come up with new insights. And so BGS went through and said some things here, right? You can kind of read what he said here. He said that the article that questioned the link between poverty and crime was lazy, and that there is definitely a correlation between the two. And he also said that the article was cherry picking the data and that the facts are half-baked. And I said, you know what, man, that makes sense to me. He went through and talked about how, black people were having a different situation than the rest of the economy, and how he tied everything in and showed the graphs to show the correlation between poverty and crime. Okay? And so that looked very interesting, so I looked at it some more. And what I did is I kind of went through the information, and I didn't find any causality between poverty and crime. And that's pretty surprising to myself, I believed what Mr. BGS had put on his site, but whenever I started looking at the data a little bit more, I started coming up with a little bit different situation. I'm not a fan of Obsidian. I think he left out some things that whenever it comes to how things are planned in the policy and how things are planned from the U.S. government. But when you look at the data, it shows something different than what BGS kind of put out there. There's a correlation, but the causation is a little bit tougher to prove out. So what I've done is I've gone through and I've provided a link to look at the difference between causation and correlation, and what happens when you mix up those two. This lady right here is a mathematician and scientist that talks about how throughout the years people have gone through and mixed up the two and what some of the consequences are. I'm not going to go into that. I started to do that, but after looking at things, I kind of revamped it. Just let her do it. All right. Here's some of the information that I looked at first. Whenever I looked at some of these journals, I looked over here at some of these tables to look at some of what the experiments were saying. So over here, you'll see this is violent crime, this is property crime, and you have these other information. These are correlations and independent variables. So whenever you went in and you look at the data at this one, as population increased, the violent crime went down, right? You would think as the population went up, the incidence of crime would go up. You would think that there's a positive correlation, but instead there's a negative correlation. When you see the Gini coefficient going up, then the crime is going to go up for violent crime. But for property crime, it's kind of a different situation. As the Gini coefficient goes up, then the property crime goes down. It's not very much, but it's still, kind of one of those things that I would look at as kind of an indicator of what's happening. And most of you probably know that this Gini coefficient is a reflection of what income disparity. So you got a bunch of people that are rich living next to people that are poor, right? As poverty goes up, violent crime goes up here. As poverty goes up, you have a smaller increase in property crime. You would expect this to be closer to 1. A 1 is going to indicate that there's a 1-to-1 relationship, and you see this 0.36 is about 36% of property crime or poverty can attribute towards crime. I would have expected that to be a little bit more. Unemployment, as unemployment goes up, then you expect crime to go up. So this one and this one are pretty similar, 36% versus 37% on violent crime. So even if we did give more jobs or we increase people's income or wealth, it's going to help out a little bit, but not a whole lot. Okay, as people graduate high school or they become more educated, you see them doing less violent crime. But as people graduate high school, you see them doing more property crime. That's again, that's kind of a mixed bag. And I guess whenever I go through this is what I see is a kind of a mixed bag. There's nothing there to kind of say, okay, across the board, we're going to see an increase with crime and an increase with poverty. I can go down here some more and look at this stuff, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. All right. Whenever I go through some of the literature, psychology people, what do they say? They say there's no experimental or quasi-experimental evidence in the United States that links child outcomes to economic deprivation in the first several years of life. Understanding the nature of socioeconomic influences as well as their potential use in evidence-based policy recommendation requires greater attention to identifying causal effects. So they're looking at the consequences of poverty. Even in those, they're saying that you got to look closer at some of the causal effects. And you could look at the article a little bit more. I've got links to where this is from in the title here. Patrick Sharkey, he's one of those big guys that's in this whole thing. He's done a lot of research into this. Most theoretical models do not make this assumption that there's a direct causal relationship between poverty and criminal behavior. Very little empirical research that provides convincing evidence for a direct causal relationship between individual poverty and criminal activity. Some suggest that research is consistent with causal relationship, but most research does not assess it directly. Instead, most theoretical and empirical evidence suggests that poverty is linked with criminal behavior through individual characteristics and conditions associated with poverty, such as joblessness, family structure, peer network, psychological strain, or exposure to intensely violent environments. So, I mean, it's kind of back and forth with the difference. So even though you have joblessness as a component, it's not a direct causal thing with crime. Here's another journal here. I'm going to go through this kind of fast because I'm on a time limit on how much I can record and upload at once. You get the same thing here from another journal. Another journal, you get the same thing where they're talking about how there's more research to be done. Another journal talking about the same thing, more research to be done. World Bank information. Here's the conclusion of another article. No direct relationship between inequality and property crime by running regression. Income inequality. And this one here is going to talk about how there's a difference between the United States and Europe and the direct ties between poverty and crime. But more research is to be done. That's probably the most interesting for you guys that are pro BGS. Here's another one that talks about, the same thing. And I think what you need to do is you have to look at the causality between poverty and crime in order to really get somewhere. So that's my 2 cents, and that's why I say there's no direct causal relationship between the two. And here's just some more slides that BGS has kind of put forth. And you can see this is a correlation, but not a causality. Interesting, but correlation, not causality. And it's a great theory that I can kind of look into, but that direct link has not been there through the journals that I posted. So you guys mull through the information. Let me know what you think. All right, peace.